Good morning. President Trump announced his long-heralded war on the pharmaceutical industry last Friday. He called his modest set of proposals the most sweeping action in history. A different assessment came from Jefferies Investment Bank's trading desk, which tweeted as it watched the spike in big pharma stock prices as the president gave his speech, Jay-Z's blueprint far more impactful than Health and Human Services version. So with little likelihood of substantive reform in the near future, what do patients do about sky-high drug prices, and how can we understand and tell their stories? And how do we end up in this situation anyway, where the U.S. spends twice as much per capita as other developed countries on prescription drugs, with price hikes showing no signs of relenting? Here to help us decode all this and to help reporters tell stories on these trends in their communities are three distinguished panelists. Dr. Aaron Kesselheim is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member at the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Katie Thomas is a staff writer at the New York Times, covering the business of healthcare with a focus on the pharmaceutical industry. David Mitchell is the founder of the nonprofit Patients for Affordable Drugs. He has an incurable but treatable blood cancer called multiple myeloma, which is very expensive to treat. He just saw about $21,000 spent yesterday for a transfusion that literally keeps him alive at a price tag of $450,000 a year. And he's become a leading consumer voice on high drug prices. This webinar is made possible through the generous support of the National Institute of Healthcare Management Foundation. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few operating procedures. We'll hear first from all of our speakers, then we'll open it up to your questions for the final 15 to 20 minutes. Because we have several hundred people participating in the webinar, we'll ask you to comment in the question field in your control panel, and we'll read out your questions. If you have technical challenges, please also text us to the question or comment field in your control panel. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag drug prices. Aaron, we'll start out with you. Tell us a little bit about how we ended up in this situation.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for having me here. So I'm going to start off today by talking a little bit about why drug prices are high and what some of the policy responses that are available to try to deal with them. As was said, I'm an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and I run the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law, which is an interdisciplinary research group among the largest, if not the largest in the country. It's groups that are independent, which is to say that none of us take any personal money from the pharmaceutical or medical device industry, but we focus on intersections between drug law, regulation, and therapeutics. And so it's a pleasure to be here and be able to talk about these issues. So prescription drug spending in the U.S. Rose about 12% in 2015, another 6% in 2016, and currently accounts for about $450 billion in annual spending. You can cut it a couple different ways, but it mostly amounts to about 1/5 of every healthcare dollar, about a fifth of about one out of every $4 being spent on prescription drugs. And as was said, the amount of money that we spend on prescription drugs per capita far exceeds the amount spent in other industrialized countries as a function of the price of the drugs themselves, as well as to a lesser extent a function of use of the products in the U.S. High drug prices and high drug spending is primarily a result of brand name drug prices, which account for about 10% of all prescriptions, but about 72% of spending overall, and have been increasing at a rate far beyond the consumer price index or even other aggregate healthcare spending over the last decade. At the bottom of this chart, you can see a little graph showing increases at 164% for a bucket of brand name drugs in blue, as compared to the consumer price index in orange. And actually in black on the bottom, you can see prices for generic drugs, a bucket of generic drugs over that time. So there have been a small number of cases of older off-patent generic drugs that have seen increases in prices, but in general, for the vast majority of generic drugs remain extremely inexpensive in the United States, and actually far less expensive in the United States for some cases than in other countries. And we can talk a little bit about why it seems to be that we have such a well-functioning market in generic drugs, whereas we have a very inefficient, poorly functioning market for brand name prescription drugs. So why are drug prices high? They're high because the U.S. Allows pharmaceutical manufacturers to charge whatever the market will bear. There is no regulation at all at any level on what pharmaceutical manufacturers can charge for their products, and at the same time, they're able to get away with those prices because of patents and other market exclusivities that we give to pharmaceutical manufacturers that protect them from any kind of competition for a limited period of time. And during that period of time, very fundamentally, during that period of time, we make it very hard for competitors or for payers to negotiate with brand name drug companies in trying to reduce the prices of the drugs and negotiate for a lower price due to various laws and regulations that we'll get into. So it's the combination of these three factors really that drives high prescription drug prices in the U.S. And so when we think about ways of trying to reduce prescription drug prices and policy solutions for trying to address prescription drug prices, I think it's useful to think about three different time periods in the market. The brand name market exclusivity period, then the transition to generic drugs, and then the multi-source generic drug period that follows. And so I want to break down sources of high drug prices and increased spending during each of those three periods in the remaining part of my time. So what I want to first do is talk about the brand name market exclusivity period. So by law, all new drugs, every single new drug that comes on the market is guaranteed a minimum period of 6 to 7 years of market exclusivity with no competition. If you're an antibiotic, actually a new antibiotic, you get 11 to 12 years of guaranteed market exclusivity, and all biologic drugs get 12 years of market exclusivity. In addition to that, nearly all drugs are protected by patents, which are grants of market exclusivity that last 20 years. But because the patent on the active ingredient of the sort of fundamental the medication is discovered or synthesized, so then it has to go through a 6 to 8 year process of development before it gets FDA approval and reaches the market. And so there's less time left on that patent. And so we actually studied how long drugs get on average. And it appears that drugs get on average about 12 and a half years of market exclusivity before they face generic competition. And actually, if you're a first-in-class, highly innovative drug, you get a period of about 14 and a half years of guaranteed market exclusivity. And during that period, because you are the monopolist, you can charge whatever price you are able to get away with, whatever price the market will bear for your product during that time. But the thing is that during that same period, we place various limits on government and private payers' abilities to negotiate. So the FDA, of course, has no authority to regulate drug prices during this time. And Medicare, which covers about 45 million lives and accounts for about a third of the nation's drug expenditure, is statutorily prevented from negotiating drug prices or setting a drug formulary, for its Medicare Part D. And so the 2003 Medicare Modernization Act that set up Medicare Part D says that the HHS secretary cannot interfere with the negotiations of prices or institute a price structure for Part D drugs. And similarly for Part D drugs are the retail drugs that are purchased in the formulary in general, and the inpatient drugs that are provided in hospitals' offices are provided through Part B, where again the manufacturer just kind of sets the price. And this is unlike any other good or service that Medicare covers. All other Medicare goods and services, X-rays, physician reimbursement, colonoscopies, these are all prices are all generated in negotiation with Medicare, or Medicare sets the price for those products. Medicaid, which covers 75 million lives, is the state the state and federal government payer for mostly for poor patients. Medicaid gets the best price that the company it gives in the private market. But because Medicaid is required to cover nearly all prescription drugs that the FDA approves, Medicaid states are unable to generally negotiate lower prices for Medicaid drugs beyond what they're able to get in the private market. The VA actually is among government payers has the most authority to be able to negotiate prices and set a formulary. And actually, the prices that the VA gets are among the best in the government, and in some cases, for new drugs are sort of on the same level as what is gotten in some European countries. These restrictions apply to other payers as well. One of the major restrictions that makes it difficult for private payers to negotiate drug prices during these market exclusivity periods is the lack of comparative effectiveness information, which is to say the ability for drugs to compare how a drug works as compared to other drugs. And only about half of all drugs had any kind of comparative effectiveness information at the time that they were approved. Whereas state laws, and then there are state laws that require private payers to cover drugs, such as the state laws that are existent in about 2/3 of states, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, that require states to cover off-label uses of cancer drugs. So what are some of the policy solutions in this period of time? Well, one of the things that we can do is we could try to give public payers greater latitude to use evidence-based formula. Pharmacists to use their skill and be able to substitute a drug that would work just as well as your drug, even if it isn't exactly the same, which like a generic drug is. But a drug, this is what allows drug manufacturers to change their formulation slightly and create a tablet version of a capsule product and then sell that tablet version for a very high price, because the tablet and the capsule versions can't be interchanged at the formulary. And so if we give pharmacists a little bit more flexibility to make those kinds of substitutions where the evidence shows it's allowable, we could help provide more effective competition between different brand name manufacturers. People have also recommended engaging in international reference pricing for public programs and saying Medicare is not going to pay more than the average of the next 5 largest payers around the world. And then there's been this other thing that's been proposed is this sort of fallback mechanism where actually the government can step in to patents and pay the manufacturer for the patent and then use the drug for a public health purpose. And most recently, that's come in the context of this opioid reversal agent naloxone, which is a 100-year-old drug, but is very expensive because of patents on the delivery mechanism, the delivery device, as opposed to the product itself. And so it's been argued that the government should just step in, reimburse the patent holder for those patents, and then produce the drug broadly at a low cost for widespread use, given the opioid crisis. Other solutions during this time would be to produce and disseminate better information about the clinical and economic value of drugs, so that you can better compare drugs and be able to evaluate which drugs provide better value. Reevaluating use of drug coupons, which divert patients away from lower cost alternatives into more expensive products that are, when they're available, direct-to-consumer advertising and free samples at physicians' offices. Also direct consumers towards using expensive brand name products, because generic drugs generally don't advertise their services or provide free samples. And dispense as written prescriptions, again, is a thing that physicians can do to try to prevent, to sort of direct patients towards using brand name drugs as opposed to generic drugs. And of course, integrating more knowledge about these issues into physicians' education would be useful. So the next section is the brand to generic transition period. So generic drugs are the only kind of competition that consistently and substantially lowers drug prices. They emerge at the end of the market exclusivity period, usually because of a lawsuit that a generic manufacturer can bring. But there's usually a lot of brand name manufacturers spend a lot of time trying to delay generic entry as long as possible. And so sometimes they'll divert those lawsuits that generic manufacturers bring by settling with the generic manufacturer in what's called a pay-for-delay settlement, which have been cut back in some ways in the past few years, but still persist. And brand name manufacturers engage in other kind of life cycle management strategies to delay generic entry as long as possible by hopping from product to product, from a tablet version to a capsule version, or from a 20 milligram version to a 22 milligram version of their product, trying to stay one step ahead of generic manufacturers, or by getting patents, so-called secondary patents on other aspects of their products that will block generic entry and each patent that they get lasts 20 years, and this will extend the market exclusivity past the original active ingredient patent. So some of the solutions in this time period are to re-examine these patents administratively by this Patent Trial and Appeals Board that was created in 2011. That would try to make it harder for brand name manufacturers to engage in other kinds of life cycle management strategies. And follow-on biologics is another topic area that we can talk about in the question and answer period about how we get follow-on biologics to provide the same kind of generic competition that might be available from expensive biologic drugs. Okay, and so then my last set of comments is about this third period of generic competition, that just because a drug is generic doesn't mean that it's cheap. In order to have a cheap generic, you need multiple competitors, and here you can see that the price declines for generic drugs based on the number of competitors that are in the market. That is a problem, because when we looked at drugs that were approved over the last 25 years, we found that and you can see on the far left, about 15% of drugs lack generic competition, and about one third of drugs have 3 or fewer generic competitors. And so what you can do during this period is you can try to import generic drugs from other well-regulated markets to try to respond to price hikes, like we currently do, to try to respond to shortages. There have been some discussions about building non-for-profit generic manufacturers or getting government purchasing contracts to try to stabilize the market for older products, older niche products that don't attract enough competitors, and then getting the Office of Generic Drugs more funding so that there's less of a line in trying to get generic competitors onto the market. Okay, so then my last slide is that there's these common perceptions that better pricing mechanisms will undercut innovation, but innovation is actually performed in that sort of innovation that leads to transformative new drugs is performed in academic institutions and supported by public investment. And so as long as we keep that going, then we will get this new supply of products for the diseases that need them. And that indefinitely extending market exclusivity is actually not the right way to go if you want to try to incentivize the generation of important new products. And it's also worth remembering that large brand name companies had about a 22% profit in 2015, whereas the rest of the Fortune 500 profits are more at like 6 or 7%. And the other big common misperception is that better pricing is politically impossible, whereas 3/4 of Americans feel that drug costs are unreasonable, which makes this a Democrat and a Republican issue. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to talk about some of these topics and put them in the context of the ideas that were proposed in the blueprint on Friday in the Q&A time.
Thank you so much, Aaron. David, we'll turn to you now, and maybe you could start out telling us how your personal battle with cancer turned you into an advocate.
Yes, there we are. So thank you very much. Hey, Aaron. Hey, Katie. And hello to everyone on the call. My journey on this issue started in 2010 when I was diagnosed with this incurable blood cancer called multiple myeloma. That picture you see is what I was doing yesterday for 5 hours and to the tune of $21,000. And this journey brought me face to face with the challenges people confront with high-priced drugs and a fundamental truth that drugs don't work if people can't afford them. I became increasingly frustrated as a patient because there were no patient groups speaking out on drug prices and trying to work to lower. I wrote a story a couple of years ago about what happened to the Multiple Sclerosis Society when they tried to speak out on pricing, and she documented the pushback they got from their industry funders. And that's why patient groups don't speak out. 83% get a lot of money from drug corporations. They put that money to good use, by the way. They use it for patient education, patient support, but they really are inhibited by their funding when it comes to the issue of pricing. And some, including a foundation that works on my cancer, actually have tried to activate patients against proposals aimed at lowering drug prices. So that frustration led to the creation of Patients for Affordable Drugs. We launched in February of last year. We're the only national patient group that focuses on drug prices, and we don't take money from any organizations that profit from development or distribution of prescription drugs. You ask, where does your money come from? Well, the fundraising pitch was that I would work for free. I retired in 2016 to do this. I would work for free. My wife and I would kick in some money, and we went to foundations and said, will you help us? And the Laura and John Arnold Foundation said yes. The public health group of the Open Society Foundation said yes. And we have received additional funding from friends and family and some patients who have kicked in, although we don't ask patients for money. We are working to elevate the voices of patients, the stories of patients struggling with high drug prices. Since last February, we've collected 13,000 stories. Most of them are up on this map. We're always running behind, and you can look and search and see the stories that we get. And we're now approaching 85,000 actually email addresses. We're building a community of patients that can be mobilized in support of policies that will lower drug prices. How? Well, there's legislation moving at the state level, and here you see a patient who testified in Oregon. Next to her, that's Carolyn Wilson. Next to her is Pam Stussel, who on the eve of the vote on Senate Bill 17, a transparency and price notification bill in California, flew from Southern California to Sacramento, participated in the news conference, and to lobby her elected officials in support of Senate Bill 17. We are training patients, not only engaging them, but training them to do this work. The result is that we're getting some legislative successes at the state level. Everywhere you see a highlighted state, there's been a bill that's been enacted, and these are sort of significant bills. There have been gag clause bills, PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, the people who run your prescription drug insurance programs and who negotiate on behalf of Medicare patients for Part D. Sometimes they impose gag clauses on pharmacists so they can't tell you if there's a cheaper option than the one under your plan, and 20 states have outlawed gag clauses. But we're having legislative successes around the country with bills that this is a bill that would stop a form of abuse that gets in the way of generics from coming to market on time. And we have flown patients in from all over the country to meet with their legislators and talk about the need for the CREATES Act. A couple of weeks ago, in advance of the president's big rollout of their plan, we met with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we brought 3 patients to Washington to meet with the Secretary. And then 2 of them were invited back to be in the Rose Garden when the president made his announcement. So we are finding, engaging, training, and activating patients to do what no one was doing before, which is speak up on behalf of patients about the need to lower high drug prices. What's a story that we might tell about a way that the kinds of tools that Aaron described that the drug companies use are put to work? Well, there's a drug called Revlimid. It's made by the company Celgene. I took this drug for 5.5 years until I got a blood clot. It's one of the side effects of this drug. I may go back on it at some point with a blood thinner, but in 1950s, there was a drug invented called thalidomide. It was used to treat morning sickness. It caused terrible birth defects. And it kind of went into mothballs for a time. Then in the 1990s, accidentally, it was discovered that it had effectiveness against multiple myeloma by modulating one's immune system. So they brought it to market with the name Thalamid, and then they tweaked a molecule to create a drug called lenalidomide, and then it became brand name Revlimid. It's very effective against my cancer. Today, Revlimid accounts for 63% of the revenue of Celgene. Last year, Celgene raised the price of Revlimid 20% to $18,000 for 28 capsules. How do they get away with it? Well, they have failed to provide samples to generic companies so that they can do the testing to develop a generic equivalent, and they entered into a big pay-for-delay deal with a company called Natco. You watch, yesterday, the Secretary of Health and Human Services referenced this company without naming them, and on Thursday, the FDA is going to post stories of companies that are doing abuses like this, and we believe Celgene will be near the top of the list. We're also teaching patients how to do media appearances, and this is one patient, Pam Holt, who appeared on CBS This Morning a couple of months ago. Talk quickly about the president's plan. The good in it, well, there is some action that they propose to take to prevent corporations from blocking cheaper generics. It's not strong enough, frankly, but they're moving in the right direction. They want to require, or they're talking about requiring, list prices to be included on direct-to-consumer advertising. That, is a way of sensitizing people about the high prices. They're talking about capping out of pocket for some medical pay for drugs that are in Part B, which is the drugs that are infused or provided in a doctor's office or a hospital, and that could produce some savings. A big deal is they're talking about requiring pharmacy benefit managers to have a fiduciary responsibility to patients, because right now pharmacy benefit managers do all of their negotiating in secret, and we don't know how much of the money they keep for themselves, how much they give to insurers, etc. What wasn't there, direct negotiations, as the president promised repeatedly, that Aaron referenced, creation of a formulary and direct Medicare negotiation, nor was there a clear set of proposals to stop patent abuse, for which there is bipartisan support on the Hill. And then there were some things that were frankly ugly, targeting other countries when we should be targeting big pharma, saying that other countries are freeloading, when in fact they're not freeloading, they're negotiating effectively on behalf of their citizens, and they're doing what I would like my government to do for me and millions of other patients. And then encouraging something called outcomes-based pricing deals, which are really only a way for the drug companies to keep control of the price and don't do any good to lower the price, and really don't do any good for patients either. Something to think about for the future that y'all should know about is we're paying for drugs twice. A story that was published, not a story, a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that all of the 210 new drugs approved by the FDA from 2010 to 2016 are based on science that was paid for through the NIH by taxpayers. Then they're being brought to market at prices of $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. These drugs are going to bankrupt families, buckle our system. We believe strongly that we need a national dialogue about this issue. We've tried to engage NIH along with Aaron and some others. They don't want to talk about it, so we're going to Congress now and beginning to have meetings to talk about how we get a national dialogue on this issue. The poster child for this is a drug called CAR-T that Novartis swooped in and bought the intellectual property for after investment by NIH to develop the drug, and they priced it at $475. Finally, we set up a new organization a couple of months ago. It is an organization configured to do electoral political work. We are going to be doing more direct state and federal lobbying with these resources, and we are going to engage in some political campaigns around the country to highlight and boost the issue of drug pricing, to hopefully contribute to a new Congress that and state houses that will take action.
Thank you, David. We're going to turn now to Katie. Katie, this is a big story. What are some of your approaches to tackling it?
Yeah, thanks for having me. What I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some good resources that I use for my drug pricing stories, but I'm going to focus mainly on how I find quote unquote real people, as we call them in journalism, and any good drug pricing story needs to be, centered around how this is affecting people. And so I'm going to give some pointers on how I do that. So the first thing is just here are some good websites that I commonly use for my my stories. The first one is mainly GoodRx, but also Blink Health and some other sources. GoodRx is great if you're not familiar with it already, because what it does is it just gives me a sense for what is the cash price of virtually any drug if you were just to walk into a pharmacy without insurance and say that you wanted to buy it. Not only does it give you kind of a breakdown of a bunch of different pharmacies near you, but at the top of the website, it will often give you some basic information about that drug, kind of what the average retail price is for that product, et cetera. If you're a journalist too, they're pretty media friendly. You can find their media contacts on their website, and they do a lot of research and are pretty helpful translating some of the research that they do. Kaiser Family Foundation is another great resource. They have a whole bunch of studies and reports on drug prices. The thing I find most valuable about them is their annual insurer survey. And this is a survey just of the employer insurance, but it gives a good feel for, where is insurance coverage headed right now. So much of the outrage that's been driving high drug prices is the fact that insurers who are, having to absorb these higher drug prices have been passing the cost along to patients. And so patients are seeing higher deductibles, higher out-of-pocket costs, and this survey comes out every year and it goes back historically, and it can help you sort out, where are things going. I also find super helpful. So much of this conversation is about the drug companies, but it's also about all the other so-called middlemen down the chain. And Adam Fine of Drug Channels, he's a consultant. He does do work for the industry, but I find his stuff is pretty good. Sometimes it gets fairly in the weeds, but he kind of breaks down the PBM and pharmacy world pretty good. He's also someone who's pretty responsive and always willing to get on the phone and talk through stuff. Peter Bach from Memorial Sloan Kettering, another, like Aaron here and David and others, is another frequent voice on drug pricing and has a lot of good stuff on his website. I also rely a lot on ProPublica's databases. While they're not directly related to drug pricing, one of them is called Dollars for Docs. There's a similar federal website called Open Payments, which actually may be more extensive at this point, but it helps you evaluate what kind of money doctors are getting from drug and device companies. And then also something called, I think it's called Prescriber's Checkup or Prescription Checkup, and it's got a lot of Medicare data, very user-friendly, that helps you understand what drugs are doctors prescribing. So as I said, most of what I'm going to talk about is how to find patients who are affected by high drug prices and then how to vet them. So for several months last year, but I've been doing this for a while, but particularly several months last year, I worked with Charlie Ornstein at ProPublica, and together we wrote a bunch of stories about drug pricing. And one in particular ran in March. It was called The Price They Pay. And what we wanted to do is see what their life was like. So here's my basic way of finding patient stories. The first and easiest way is to do what we call a call out, which is basically ask readers to submit their stories to you. it's great because you can design, a little questionnaire for them to answer, so you can figure out which questions that you want to be answered. You promote it, on your homepage, you tweet it, you embed it in the stories that you're writing on this topic. I think we have about 1,500 responses right now in our database, and it's something that I use on an ongoing, I use it all the time now. There are some drawbacks that you should be aware of when you do these, though. One is the obvious. You're going to alert anybody who goes to your website to what your next story is about. So if it's simply, we want to hear about high drug prices, well, that's no surprise that the New York Times or any other outlet is looking at that. But you just want to be mindful that, whatever you're putting out there, your competitors will see as well. The main concern, it's something that I just always keep in the back of my mind with this, is that you're getting the readers of your own publication. And so you can risk getting an echo chamber, and not necessarily people who are fully representative of the whole country. So it's very valuable. And like I said, I use it a lot, but it's not the only thing that I use. The next one is Twitter, Facebook, other social media. With Twitter, I try to narrow down personal stories by using personal words like my or I, or if it's a family member, maybe daughter or son. In the case of EpiPen, that was pretty valuable. My insurer, if you're talking about insurance coverage and the drug. You want to filter out people who are giving their opinion on high drug prices and try and narrow down to people who are actually experiencing it firsthand. And the other thing that I do is I often, again, on competitor kind of mindset here, I usually try and find these people offline, or try to find them independently at some other source before I will at them on Twitter, just because I don't want to tip people off. On Facebook, somewhat similar. A tip on Facebook is I'm a member of this one group called Paying Till It Hurts, which is Libby Rosenthal from Kaiser Health News. It's her group. I don't typically post to Facebook and say, hey, I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I'm doing a story about X. I have done that, but usually what I use it as is a resource. I search that group and the group's history to see if there's anyone else who's been experiencing an issue that I'm looking for. I also go to patient advocacy groups a lot. I've used David Mitchell has helped me a lot. He's got a great database. He can talk about more about patient stories. If you're a local outlet, or even if you're not, one good idea is to go to kind of local service groups. You can think of it as, big disease-oriented patient groups like the National MS Society, for example, is one that has helped me before find patients. But also, if you're a local outlet, you could find a group that is, providing healthcare services to underserved groups, and call them up and tell them the story you're working on and seeing if they can help you there. The last place that I look is GoFundMe and other fundraising sites. Those are great directly from that site. Here's just an image of our own call out that we used all last year to try and get responses to our drug prices story. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is how to vet your patients. It's not that you think you found someone, they're willing to talk, your task is really just beginning. This is very complicated stuff. A lot of times the patients themselves don't have it all sorted out, and it's quite a lot of work, quite frankly, to try and sort out what's really going on, but it's vitally important. The first thing I do after I've had a nice conversation with the person and they've gotten the rundown of their basic story is I'll ask them to share as many of their documents as possible. It could be their explanation of benefits, it could be pharmacy bills, it could be insurance denials. If they're a little hesitant, you can offer, you can send it in to me redacted. You can redact any date of birth or any kind of sensitive information. But I will note, if they are okay with it and, it's properly redacted, publishing their document can also be like really powerful element of your story and gives a lot of credibility. I will caution you, I've had a lot of situations where people can't back up their story at all. And I would consider moving on from those folks, not because I don't believe them, but because you want to go with the strongest story you have. And here's one that I struggle with a lot as, someone who tries to be nice a lot is, we're trained not to talk about people's financial situation, right? And so even now as a reporter, sometimes I find myself hesitating to kind of dig deeper and ask about these financial details, but you absolutely have to. And a lot of times what's interesting about these people's stories, and that what we've really highlighted in some of the pieces that we've done, is how, high drug costs are spilling over into other areas of their lives. They've had to sell personal belongings like clothes and furniture, even a motorcycle once, all kinds of ways that you might not even see. So don't be afraid to kind of dig in there. The other thing is that a lot of times I can almost guarantee you, if you're writing somebody's story, there's going to be details that just don't add up and don't make sense. Just go back. If your gut is telling you, wait, I don't get this, readers are not going to get it either. And I've had to go back multiple times, sometimes back and forth with patients, ask them to submit more documents, et cetera, until I can really feel like I'm confident that I understand their story. A couple more tips here. Ask to speak to the patient's doctor. I don't always do this, but sometimes it can help, especially if, again, you're not quite understanding the patient's story. Do just a basic search, Google search on the person you're talking to. You just want to make sure, you just want to understand where they're coming from. Do they have another agenda? Are they political in one way or another? It's just something that might lead to another conversation with that person. It doesn't always disqualify them, but it's something that you want to know about. The other thing is very frequently when we're talking about patient stories and drug pricing, it comes down to an element of it is insurance coverage. And so you're going to be calling the insurer anyway for comment. One thing that I've noticed insurers do more recently is they'll actually comment on an individual patient. They would be open to that, because that's been valuable to me. And it, again, gives me just a little bit more confidence in this story when I'm like, okay, I've heard from every single player here, and I'm pretty confident that this patient's story is correct. The last two things, I won't belabor them, but one is just be mindful of the mix. It's getting back to that echo chamber. If you're going to be focusing on the lives of several different patients, make sure it's representative of whichever problem that you're writing about. The New York Times is a national paper. We make sure that it's demographically diverse in various ways, or geographically diverse, racial, class, as much male, female, as much as we can balance it out, we do. And then the last thing is just fact check. There's two reasons for that. One is that I like to go over this because you're taking a very, very complex story and you're often condensing it down to maybe 4 sentences sometimes of someone's life. And so in doing that, you could easily make mistakes. And so just a final check to make sure you got it right. And then the second thing is it's a way to kind of give your source a sense of here's what is going to end up in public, and it just, I don't like to have any surprises. I want them, they've given me the dignity of sharing, their story with me, and I want to make sure that they just have a sense of what's going to come out, even if it's not giving them an advance copy, which I don't do. I just wanted to walk through now this one case study. Charlie Ornstein and I at ProPublica, we basically, like I said, we did this call out. We got hundreds of responses. We just started reading through them and looking for trends. And one thing that we saw a lot was people who were frustrated. They said that they had been on some products, some pain products that were more expensive and less addictive, and insurers were pushing them on to cheaper but possibly more addictive opioids. That sounded really intriguing to us. And we found a number of examples of people who had just written into us from our call out. So we followed up with some of those, but we also searched Twitter and Facebook. We found a whole bunch of additional examples of that. this happening, which gave us confidence that this is something real. This wasn't just the people who were writing into us. One of the people we found was this woman named Alyssa Urkis. And she has a chronic condition that leads to chronic pain, and she'd been taking a product called Belbuca, which is a form of the drug buprenorphine. It's like a patch that is an opioid, but it's a less addictive opioid. And she said that United had changed their policy, and now she was forced to be on stronger opioids. So I actually found her through Etsy. Like I said, I tried to go a little bit of a roundabout way, and she also sells stuff on Etsy, so I ended up sending her a message that way. I spoke to her, I got a whole rundown on her story, and then she sent me a whole bunch of documents. One of them was this prior authorization denial that she got, which, as you can see here, there's a section that talks about how she hasn't taken morphine controlled release tablets. Another aspect of her story was that she was able to be prescribed much more addictive painkillers without case. And after talking to her doctor, I also asked the doctor for more records, and she sent me a whole bunch of stuff. One example here is, from the very beginning of last year, it's a call report where Elisa had called in and said that she went to her Walmart to refill her Butrans. United had changed its policy, and it needed a prior authorization. So that was just the beginning of Elisa's saga, but this was an example of one of the documents that we got. And then here's the final story, which had a big impact, and I think it was made a lot stronger by the fact that we featured the story of her and other people who were living this firsthand. So I think that's it. Here's how to reach me. Feel free to reach out on my email, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I just want to tell our audience that this is really the time for your questions. So please go into the control panel and type any questions for our speakers. We have a few already. I'll start with one from Carrie Feivel of KPCC, who asks, how can we put the $1 out of our $5 healthcare dollars spent on prescriptions in context? If we count one prescription as a, quote, healthcare encounter, can we compare the usage to other healthcare encounters or procedures? Are prescriptions as the solution to a medical complaint likewise 20% of other suggested prescribed solutions such as surgery or imaging or physical therapy? Aaron, this sounds like a question for you.
All right, I can try to address that. I mean, I think it's a really thoughtful and detailed question, and it's probably worth a conversation offline if you wanted to reach out. But I mean, I think that there are, again, like I said, prescription drugs being 20% of healthcare spending means that that's a very substantial part of overall healthcare spending, and that's not to discount, excessive spending and that goes into unnecessary procedures or too many MRIs or those kinds of things as well. And I think that we need to think about excessive spending in all parts of the healthcare dollars to make sure that we're being optimally efficient everywhere. And there are plenty of places where spending on prescription drugs and that are very effective and useful will help prevent more expensive hospitalizations, and in those cases, the spending is justified. But there is a lot of circumstances in which we're spending a lot of money on brand name drugs when generic drugs that work just as well are available, or when we're spending a lot of money on brand name drugs that could be less expensive if there was a better market that would allow for more effective negotiating and try to reach a more value-based price.
Can I jump in here too?
Absolutely.
Two things. Value-based pricing is a useful tool, as Aaron points out. One thing you got to be careful of is that the drug companies want credit for every year of improved life that they create with a new drug. So the right question is, what is a price that maximizes accessibility and affordability while maintaining a robust R&D pipeline for new drugs, which I need, and reasonable profits for the companies? The other thing is, if we're going to compensate drug companies for every year of quality life that their drug makes, then we should be paying a physician who corrects a congenital defect at birth a couple of $1 million. And we should have charged at least $1 million for the polio vaccine I received when I was 6 years old. So we need to take care when we try to apply value frameworks. The other thing to remember is that a point Aaron made at the outset, every other element of our healthcare system has prices that are negotiated by or set by the government. Physician payment, lab payments, hospital procedures, doctor procedures. The only sector of healthcare that we don't impose some sort of pricing mechanism on is the drug companies, and they get to charge whatever they want.
We have a question for David, but Katie, did you want to jump in on this at all before I turn to the next question?
One way that I heard somebody say this one time onto what David said was it's like charging instead of filling a pothole and charging for the cost of filling a pothole. If they were to bill for the amount of money that they would have prevented from the damage to a car, right? It doesn't make sense in that context, and many people think it doesn't make sense in the other context either.
So we have a question from Nina Bandali. David, please expand upon your thoughts around outcomes-based pricing.
Okay, well, there's value pricing, which Aaron has referred to, and we just touched on, where you try and figure out what is the value of a new drug to patients, and then that is a very useful input for negotiating a price. That's how the VA, the Veterans Administration, uses value-based pricing. They take an analysis from a group called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review of a new drug that tries to determine what is the value of this drug to patients compared to other treatments, and they use that as one input for negotiations. Outcomes pricing, which pharma also wants to call value pricing, is an arrangement whereby a deal is struck that if a drug doesn't work for a patient, then the insurer usually gets a rebate. So the celebrated example of this is for a drug called Repatha with Harvard Pilgrim, a health plan in the Boston area. This is a drug that you use for people who don't respond well to statins. And the contract is that if someone lands in the hospital with a cardiac event, a heart attack, while they're on Repatha, then there's a refund. Well, as a patient, I say, I don't really care about the refund going to my insurer. Plus, the bigger problem is that the drug company keeps control of the price. They know from clinical trials how many people are unlikely to respond to the drug, and so they can just inflate the price to compensate for that. So outcomes
We have a question from Gabriel Levitt, who's the president of pharmacychecker.com. He says, despite the technical illegality, according to a survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation, about 20 million Americans say they have imported medication for their own use because the prices are too high here. What are your thoughts on this practice, at least as a temporary lifeline to access lower prices? Should we be guiding patients to the safest international pharmacy options?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think that that considering how to do importation safely, first of all, I think that importation can be done safely, and in part because we already import 50% of our prescription drugs, and I think 80% of our active pharmaceutical products that are within the prescription drugs. And of course, that's not even considering all the food that we import and everything else. So I mean, I think that we can certainly do importation of drugs safely. I think that importation makes sense as a policy solution in the context of off-patent older drugs where there isn't intellectual property that one international firm controls, and there may be other manufacturers that are making the drug in Canada and Europe or wherever and just haven't decided to sell the drug in the United States for whatever reason. And so if somebody corners the market of an older drug in the United States in those circumstances, we should be able to figure out ways of temporarily importing drugs to be able to make sure that they don't then jack up the price on those older products. I have a harder time figuring out how large-scale importation would work as a policy solution for high-cost brand name drugs. But I'd be interested also in hearing David and Katie's thoughts on what patients and other people think about the practicality of importing. But I think that from a policy point of view, I think that importation makes most sense for older off-patent generic drugs.
I'll just jump in and say that importation is something people are doing to stay alive or to succeed in managing a chronic condition. And it's happening because our system is broken. As long as the system is broken, I don't want to get in the way of the patients who are using that lifeline, but I also want to fix our system here so we don't have to use that lifeline.
We have a question from Stephen Gendel of Initiate PR. He says, aren't David and Katie conflating drug prices that patients pay with copays? Insurance companies earn billions too. Shouldn't they be stepping up?
I don't think I'm conflating them, but when you're telling the story about of patients, often those most patients and most people in this country are insured, and so it does often boil down to how our insurers covering it, and what is the out-of-pocket cost. And yeah, I mean, all of the players have a role to play. They all are seeking profit, and I think that my coverage has actually been a lot about the insurers and the PBMs in addition to the drug manufacturers, and I think people should pay attention to all of those players.
Yeah, I would just add, as a patient, I think insurers are a pain in the butt. And we have stupid insurance policies in some cases. For example, putting drugs for which there's only one drug in a class or of a type with a certain mechanism of action in the top tier makes no sense. The reason we tier drugs is to try and encourage the use of the most effective drug at the lowest possible cost. And if there's no substitute, then putting a drug in the top tier just penalizes patients. But we need to be clear about one thing. For insurance are employers with money that could be in our paychecks if they didn't have to pay high premiums. We, with our premium sharing, taxpayers and patients. Nobody else is paying for insurance. So it's not, when people say, shouldn't insurance pay for that, what they're really saying is, shouldn't we pay for that? Well, every penny of healthcare has to be paid for, whether it's hospital costs or drug costs. It all has to be paid for, and we're the only ones paying for it. So I always like to remind people when they say, shouldn't insurance just pay for it, what they're really saying is, shouldn't we all just be willing to pay higher premiums or higher taxes? And I'm not. I want to drag down healthcare costs, and my cause is to drag down drug prices.
We have a question from Mac McCarthy. Rockford, Illinois has filed antitrust suits against, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Malik Rod and Express Scripts over the excessive price of HP Actar. Do you think other self-insured employers should follow their lead?
Well, I can
Yes?
speak to this quickly, Aaron.
Yeah, go ahead.
I am the lead plaintiff in a class action suit against Celgene for the drug that I talked about earlier, Revlimid. And so, yes, I agree that end payers should be suing drug companies for anti-competitive behavior. And I agree because I'm doing it.
So, and then we have a question from Patrick Pine. The recent administration announcement focused heavily on pharmacy benefit managers. None of your presentations have mentioned pharmacy benefit managers. Do you have any observations as to the role of PBMs, positive or negative?
So
I'll
go
ahead.
Oh, all right, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I said insurer, I often meant PBM. From my reporting perspective, it kind of depends on the situation. But I write a lot about PBMs, and sometimes when I say insurer, I actually mean PBM.
So, I mean, I would say that PBMs were, initially seen as a private market response to try to, help payers negotiate better. And PBMs can bring substantial value to the system by, trying to improve adherence and trying to provide some attempted counterweight. However, it's also true that PBMs, are for-profit companies as well, and when rebates increase, when list prices increase, their rebates increase, and and that's kind of tied to PBM's business model. And so there's been some concern about how effective PBMs are in containing costs, and how much the rebates are being passed on to patients and payers. I mean, I think that I think that more, insight into the PBM business model and makes a lot of sense to try to figure out, how much efficiency the PBMs actually bring to the system versus how much of a drag they are. But I think that it's overall at the end of the day, it is still the pharmaceutical manufacturers that are setting the price in the first place. And I don't crackdowns on PBMs as a way of trying to contain drug prices is the opportunity to do that is going to diminish in the next couple of years, and I don't think it's going to ultimately make much of a difference when it comes to drug prices.
I do think it's a model that's changing as we speak. Yeah. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
I have just a teeny addition to what Aaron and Katie said. I did reference PBMs in my presentation. I believe that we have a bad system with PBMs where they are making their money based on a rebate that is opaque. We can't tell what's going on inside PBMs, and they are an expression of our public policy because they negotiate on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries like me. So I believe we need greater transparency from PBMs, and I do think that a proposal to make PBMs be responsible with a fiduciary responsibility to patients is a useful thing to discuss, because right now their main responsibility is to their shareholders. Their secondary responsibility is to insurers, but they also get paid by the drug companies. So I'm not as sanguine about PBMs, perhaps, as some others. I would like to see much, much better oversight of PBMs.
So I'm afraid we've run out of time. I will try and sneak in one final question from a reporter to Katie, which is, do you have any suggestions for what should be in a waiver template that you email the patient and that can be provided to an insurer?
Actually, the insurer will usually provide it. That's been my experience. So I would just, if you think that that's something that might come up in the early conversation with the person, just say, like, would you be open to this? I mean, I don't think it's a deal breaker, but just introducing the idea to a person is, and I've actually had every single person that has been approached about this has said yes. So usually then it's the insurer that has their own form that you have to then send back to the patient.
So with that, we're going to end our webinar. I want to thank our excellent panelists for all their insights. and to all of our audience members for their excellent questions. We'll be sending everybody a survey shortly, and we will ask you to take a moment to let us know what you thought of this webinar and your ideas for future ones. You'll be able to find an archived version of everybody's PowerPoint slides as well as the webinar itself on centerforhealthjournalism.org. Thank you so much, and have a good day.